Testing, testing. Okay, I'm getting the signal from the sound booth, so we're online streaming now, and so we'll go ahead and get our class started. I want to welcome everyone today, and this being Memorial Day weekend, we're glad to see you here and hope that you enjoy the time spent with family and reflecting on the blessings that the people who gave their lives for our freedoms have bestowed upon us. This is the last week of our 13-week series taken from the 4 early Old Testament books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1 Samuel. And our subject matter for the quarter has been about the Israelites and the narrative of their conquest of the Promised Land and their vacillating faith in God and how we can relate to their experiences. And we have followed their story from the time Moses said his goodbyes to the people he had led out of Egypt and had served them as God's spokesperson on the way to the Promised Land. A journey that, if they had traveled by foot for 8 hours a day, should have taken them less than 3 weeks to make. But unfortunately, due to a lack of faith on their part in trusting God's promise to them that He would help them conquer this land, that journey ended up taking them 40 years. Now just imagine, instead of 21 days, it took them 15,000 days to make this journey. Most of the Israelites who left Egypt with Moses did not even live to see the day when the nation would cross the Jordan River and take possession of the land called Canaan. And sadly, because of his own shortcomings, even Moses was not allowed to guide the people into the Promised Land. Instead, that responsibility fell on the shoulders of his successor, Joshua. And from the time that they crossed the Jordan River and conquered Jericho, which was the first of 33 major cities, in all Joshua led Israel for a total of 50 years. And near the end of his life, Joshua expresses some important words of encouragement and hope for God's people. He says to them, "The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to stand against you. One of you can chase away 1,000 enemies. That is because the Lord your God fights for you, just as He promised. So be careful to love the Lord your God." Now, these next words are among his last. "Now I'm about to die, just as everyone else on the earth does. The Lord your God has kept all the good promises He gave you. Every one of them has come to pass. Not one has failed to come true. And you know that with all your heart and soul." And indeed, for Israel, under Joshua's leadership, these were the best of times. And these final words of Joshua that you see on the screen will resonate in the hearts of the Israelite people for all generations. And all they had to do was to put their faith in God and to listen to His word and obey Him. But unfortunately, as we know, that is not what happened. What did happen may have been partly due to the fact that after Joshua died, no successor was named to replace him as the national leader of the Israelite people. Now, if we go to try and find a clear-cut answer as to why Joshua was not replaced, well, we come up empty-handed. We don't exactly know why no one was chosen by God to take his place. But what we do know is that after Joshua and those of his generation had all died, a new generation had either not been properly trained about who God was and all the great and good things that He had done for the people, or if they had been taught, for some reason, this new generation chose not to acknowledge God as their sovereign and submit to His law and follow His direction, that is, obey Him. And so often we hear the question raised, why couldn't the Israelites remain faithful to God? That question has been raised several times this quarter in this very class. Why was that? After He had demonstrated before their very eyes His mighty power in the way He took them out of Egyptian bondage, the crossing of the Red Sea, the parting of the waters. On the way, He provided for them water to drink, and manna came down from heaven, and they had quail to eat. And He took them to a fertile and fruitful land, a land that is described as overflowing with milk and honey. And He gave it to them, and He made them a powerful nation that no enemy could stand against. So how could they not love and serve and be faithful to such a being? That is the question. And there is an answer, but to understand that answer, one must first grasp just how powerful Satan is. Satan was their enemy. He is the enemy of all humankind. And as long as there is an earth, Satan will be our greatest threat. In the second half of Judges, chapter 2, we see the tribes of Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. This is half of the 12 tribes of Israel who failed to completely drive out the Canaanites along with their kinsmen who were still residing in the land of promise, in the territories that Joshua had allotted to each tribe. Jerusalem was also known as Jebus because there were so many Jebusites that were still in the city. And after having time to regroup, the enemies of Dan chased out that tribe from the plains, the fertile plains, up into the mountains. And that was only the first of a series of tribal defeats that took place due to the Israelites' lack of faith and trust in God. And so, again, the question our generation keeps asking in the pulpits and in classes like this, why didn't the Israelites trust God? How could they turn away from Him? And we must remember that there is a much bigger picture. These are God's holy people. And there has been a prophecy. It's about one out of Abraham's many descendants, the one who it has been promised that all nations of the earth will be blessed. Satan is using everything he's got, all that he can, the resources, everything that he can assemble to prevent this prophecy from being fulfilled. The Canaanites are evil. There is nothing good about them. They must be seen as Satan's agents, and he is using them to pollute God's holy people to prevent the birth of the Messiah. And the Israelites, they are his target. And if he can get them to reject God and bow down to another god, whether it be Ashtoreth, who is the goddess of the Canaanites, she was connected with fertility and maternity. Worship of Ashtoreth was prevalent in Canaan. She was sometimes called the wife of Baal. And King Solomon, so heavily influenced by his foreign wives, fell into Ashtoreth worship, which inevitably led to his downfall. Baal was the supreme god among the Canaanites. He was worshipped in many forms. He had different names. Often he was a sun god. He was considered to be the fertility god who supposedly made the earth bear crops and fruit and women to bear children. The rites of Baal included cult prostitution, sometimes human sacrifice. You may recall a famous showdown occurring between the prophets of Baal and Elijah on Mount Carmel. But worshiping Baal was a recurring temptation to the Israelites. Worship of Baal absolutely infuriated the Lord God, and he severely punished Israel when they bowed down and worshiped Baal. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites and was also worshipped by the Ammonites. The rites involving this god were said to be cruel and almost always involved human sacrifice. Solomon erected an altar to Chemosh just south of the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem. Dagon was the Philistine god of water and grain. Samson, one of the Hebrew judges, met his death in the temple of Dagon. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, after the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they placed it in their temple next to a huge statue of Dagon. And the next day, they found the statue toppled to the floor. They righted it, but the next day it was on the floor again, but this time with its head and hands broken off. And later, the Philistines took King Saul's armor along with his severed head and displayed them in the temple of Dagon. Marduk was the god of the Babylonians and was associated with fertility and crops. Marduk had far more than 50 names, and he was also worshipped by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Now Milcom was the national god of the Ammonites, and this god was associated with witchcraft and divination and the occult, seeking to gain knowledge from the dead, conjuring them back to life. The witch of Endor probably worshipped Milcom. Now, worshiping Milcom was strictly forbidden by the Lord God. Child sacrifice was connected with this worship. Milcom was among the false gods that was worshipped by Solomon at the close of his reign. And there were many, many other gods in the land. One might say their number was legion. But they were all the same God, Satan. And whenever someone bowed down to any one of these many false gods, they were bowing down to Satan. And so now we can understand why God would tell his people when they entered the land of Canaan to conquer it, why he told them to destroy everything, to kill not only the men, the women, the children, their animals, destroy their possessions, and incinerate their cities. They were that evil. There could not have been a more effective way for Satan to pollute God's holy people. He is just a master at what he does. The Israelites were Satan's target. He was powerful. The Israelites were flesh. Flesh is weak. And even King Solomon, who was the wisest who ever lived, was influenced by the bad company of Satan's worshipers, and he fell victim to them. And that explains why the Israelites failed to remain faithful to God. They had a choice, but they were made of flesh, and flesh is weak. The one who was after them was not flesh. He was not an earthly being, and he certainly was not weak. And so as a result of all of this, in 1/3 of the chapters in the book of Judges, we will find a verse that reads word for word, just like the one you see here. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. What you see here is an authentic, recently discovered 3,100-year-old tabloid found on eBay from ancient Israel, which serves as a good illustration of just how degraded things became, the degree of the evil that was polluting the entire nation of Israel. One of the final scenes in the book of Judges is about what it is like when people are free to do as they see fit. Here is the story about an unnamed Levite and a concubine, and he was an absolute scoundrel of the vilest sort. As you will see, he was pure evil. The account is found in Judges 19, so let's take a look at how the Bible gives us the record. Now, a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. So that is the setting for the story. Now, a concubine was not necessarily a woman who lived with a man that she wasn't married to. That would today be called a partner or significant other. But in Israel, in that day, a concubine was a man's lawful wife, but she was only guaranteed about 3 things: something to eat, a place to stay, and shelter. A concubine's primary purpose was to fulfill the sexual desires and needs of her husband. She was his toy. Any children she bore her husband were not considered to be illegitimate, but they could not share in any of the family's inheritance. Now, God never approved of a man having a concubine, yet we will find several Old Testament men who did have them, including Abraham, and we're not talking about Hagar. He had many concubines in addition to the 2 wives. Jacob, Gideon, Saul, David, Solomon. That's just to name a few. Now let's pull some inferences about this Levite from what we've read. He sought sexual pleasure that was not mutual, but at the expense of another person's happiness. Because if this woman was happy, she would not have left him and returned to her parents. He didn't do anything at first, but after 4 months he decided he needed his toy back, so he went to go get her and sweet talk her into coming back with him. And this is not a one-of-a-kind story, is it? He had with him his servant, probably a young boy or teenager, and 2 donkeys. When her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him into his home. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed upon him to stay, and so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. So we might ask the question, why was this poor woman's father glad to see a man who made his own daughter a plaything, destroying any hopes that she might have of finding happiness? Now, if we are allowed to read between the lines, then we are also allowed to conclude that her father probably financially benefited from that arrangement, and that's why he was glad to see his son-in-law. Furthermore, we see the Levite spending most of his time during this visit eating and drinking, so we know that he liked to party. This partying and merrymaking with his father-in-law went on for about 5 days. Now, during that time, he accomplished his mission, and so the Levite decides it's time to take his concubine back home with him. Little did he know that the trip that he made was all in vain. Unwilling to stay another night, the man left his father-in-law and went toward Jebus with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. Now, when they were near Jebus, now remember that's also Jerusalem, but there's so many Jebusites there, the day was almost gone. And the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." But his master replied, "No, we won't go into any city where people are not Israelites. We'll go on to Gibeah." He added, "Come, let's reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." And so they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah and in the land of Benjamin. Now, instead of taking the advice of his servant, who knew that the highways then were dangerous, especially at night, this Levite recklessly walked on in the darkness, jeopardizing not only his own life, but also the lives of those who were traveling with him. He didn't want to stay in Jerusalem because it was in the hands of pagan Jebusites, and so they press on for 4 more miles to Gibeah to be with his own people. But the men of the town of Gibeah, God's own people from the tribe of Benjamin, turned out to be just as wicked as the heathens were in the city of Jebus. Among the Levites' local kinsmen in Gibeah, not a single one opened up their doors to welcome the visitors into their home and care for their needs. There was only one man in the city who showed them any concern, and he was not a Benjamite, but he was an Ephraimite who happened to live in the city. They stopped to spend the night. They went in and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, came in from his work in the fields. And when he looked and saw the travelers in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? And where did you come from?" He answered, "We're on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, where I live. I've been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going home. No one is taking me in for the night." "You're welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need, only don't spend the night in the square." And so he took him into his house and fed his donkeys, and after they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. So it seems this Ephraimite is a model of how God wanted his people to live. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Levite, his concubine wife, his servant, even the animals had all been provided for, all at the expense of this generous host. And within this man's house, for the moment at least, all was well for these travelers. But outside the house, something evil was rousing. Gibeah had become like Sodom, a city we read about in Genesis, a city that God wiped off the face of the earth because of their wickedness. The men of that city were indulged in evil practices that were unnatural, not the way that God intended, and in violation of his laws. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city, they were thugs, they were criminals, they were sex offenders, they were probably murderers in there with them, surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can know him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing." I guess this Ephraimite is to be commended for wanting to protect his guest, but then we have to ask, at what cost? Let's read further. "Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." So how very admirable an offer. Not one of us here can relate to this man. Outside the book of Judges, let me ask you, does any of this sound in any way familiar? Travelers arriving in a wicked city at night, waiting at the town square. A person offers to take them in for the night, feeds them, sees to their comfort. Wicked men of the city showing up, demanding the guests be handed over to them to do what we all know they wanted to do. The master of the house using his virgin daughter as a bargaining chip to appease them. Does any of that sound familiar? Let's go to Genesis 19. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can know them." Lot went outside to meet them, and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. They're virgins. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under my protection, under my roof." Now, does that not make anyone here wonder if Satan has a playbook that he uses on occasions? And what about Lot? Did he not also drink from a mug of coffee that said "World's Greatest Dad"? How can one defend the indefensible? We can only say of Lot, he was Lot. But back to our Levite. But the men outside would not listen to the master of the house. So the Levite took his concubine and sent her outside to them. And they raped her and abused her all throughout the night. And at dawn, when they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. Now we know even more about just how much of a reprobate this Levite was, how far he would go in behalf of himself. But unfortunately, there is more. He is truly warped. When her master got up in the morning, now how could he possibly lay down and go to sleep that night knowing what was happening to her out there on the streets? When the master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer, for she was dead. And so he put her on his donkey and set out for home. So the Levite, when he opened the door, he just happened upon his concubine. He didn't go looking for her. He had given her no thought. He just wanted to get home as quickly as he could, and he was about to leave with no thought of her. He was going to leave without her. So what is there to say? This unnamed Levite, everything was all about him. And so out of sympathy for his concubine, when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Now we're talking about evil. What kind of evil existed in the land? Why would he do that? He thought that he was the victim. He assumed no responsibility for what had happened to his concubine. In his mind, someone had broken his toy, and he wanted to turn the other 11 tribes against the tribe of Benjamin. Now, the tribe of Joseph was actually 2 tribes, making 12 tribes against 1. The Levite could have gone to Shiloh and appealed his case to the priest there and let him try to settle the matter according to God's law, but that just wasn't his style. And what a gruesome sight must have met the eyes of everyone when those parcels were opened. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt. Just imagine. We must do something. So speak up." Now the Levite got just exactly what he wanted. The leaders and soldiers from all the other tribes sent word to the leaders of the Benjamites to hand over all of those who were involved in this crime so that they could receive justice. The penalty for rape back then was death. But the leaders of Benjamin would not admit that the men of Gibeah had sinned, and they refused to surrender those who had participated in this attack on the woman. And maybe it was out of patriotism, maybe it was because they felt like they had to protect their citizens. We don't know, but they argued that she was given to the men to do as they pleased. And in a way that was true, but that did not justify or excuse what they did to her. The 11 tribes agreed as one man to attack Gibeah. And when the Benjamites heard this, they declared war on all the other tribes of Israel. And so it was a civil war. It was brother against brother. Now, how about that for what Satan can make happen? The Benjamites were exceedingly outnumbered. The odds against them, the 11 tribes together had over 400,000 soldiers. The Benjamites had 27,000. But the Benjamites were better fighters. They were better soldiers. And so in this 3-day civil war, the 11 tribes lost about 40,000 soldiers. And at the end of the war, the Benjamites were left out of 27,000 with only 600 soldiers left standing. What a price for them to pay for refusing to obey God's law. Well, it is Memorial Day weekend, and it would be nice to get out early, right? So let's bring this lesson to a close. We can be thankful that God's people today do not live in the book of Judges. We live in the book of Ruth, which is about acts of love and kindness towards others. It's hard to believe that the story of Ruth took place during the dark days of the Judges. And what a contrast there was between Boaz and this unnamed Levite. When Boaz laid eyes on Ruth, he showed her respect and shared some of what he had with her. And upon learning her story, he sought out her best interest. He cared for her deeply and redeemed her so that he could marry her and spend the rest of his days with her. He did not mistreat Ruth in any way. And that marriage was an important part of the fulfillment of prophecy regarding the greatest monarchy that ever existed. Well, thank you so much for your attendance today. I have to confess I was a little bit shaky. Larry Phelps was supposed to teach class today, but he's not feeling well, and I didn't really have that much time to prepare the lesson, so my apologies. But thank you for hanging with me, and have a good day tomorrow.